Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to be here. I've told I have about 25 minutes, so hopefully I can get the whole presentation in. And if I'm speaking too fast or something, let me know and I'll slow down. We have a replication program at 3IE. We're about 3 years into it. And I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the replication program, and then I'll go through the paper that I just finished and as kind of an example of what our program does, and then have a little bit at the end. Since I only have 25 minutes, unless you have some burning question, it might be best for you to save the questions for the end. So there's been a lot of discussion recently around research transparency and the need for a number of checks and balances and things like that about what's going on in research, concerns about research, including publication bias, coding inconsistencies. Maybe you heard about the Reinhardt and Rogoff affair and possibly issues with how coding was done. And then this idea of there's a bunch of discussion about scaling up and does scale up work, but before even you get to that idea of does it work, you have to figure out which studies should be scaled up or which interventions. And so I think replication plays a role in all of these issues, the way that we're looking at replication. So the way that we look at replication is internal replication. So I think, and from my experiences in the last 3 years, when I start talking about the replication program, most people are really interested in it because they think it is recreating the same study in a different geographic location. And that's called what we would call external replication, and that's not what we're doing. That would be very expensive and also just kind of hard to implement in terms of how do you define what is an external replication? Does it have to be the exact same intervention? And if it doesn't work, how do you decide if it didn't work because of the intervention, or did it not work because of a time, or a cultural difference, or a geographic difference? It seems like there's a lot of issues. We're open to the idea of doing external replication at some point, but at this time the replication program is internal replication. So it's trying to recreate papers or reproduce papers that have already been published using the same data, and then seeing if the papers are robust to extensions, which I'll get into in a little bit. So the replication program is designed to replicate papers that are important for policymaking. It encourages the scientific process in the sense that research is expected to be able to be replicable in theory, even though there's not a lot of people that do it right now, in the social sciences at least. The replication program at 3IE funds a number of external external researchers that do internal replications. And then we also do some in-house replications, so I'll be presenting my first in-house replication study. These are studies that are done of development interventions in developing countries. They're of papers that have been determined to be influential, innovative, or controversial in their findings. So there are 3 sections to a 3IE replication study. The first is the pure replication. The pure replication, everyone who does a 3IE funded replication study is expected to do. This is where you try and reproduce the original study using the original methods and the original raw data. So the idea is not that you just press go on the do file and then say, yep, the tables reproduce. It's that you actually take the time to try and recreate it. Right? So you have the publication, you have the raw data. Can you turn that raw data into something similar? I never really go into replication studies that I'm managing or that I'm doing myself expecting to exactly reproduce the study. I think it's very hard to get to the 3rd decimal point, and I don't think that's really important. I think it's more about, can you get similar results, right? So then there's 2 other sections of 3IE funded replication studies, and all of our replication researchers are expected to do at least one of these 2. And I'll explain, I touch briefly on both of them in my paper, but the first is MEA, this measurement and estimation analysis. And in that you look at issues of measurement. So can you redefine the outcome of interest in some way, or can you look at a different estimation method and see if you get similar results? So here you're really not expecting to get the same results because you're doing something different, but hopefully as long as the methodology is still acceptable, you would be able to get something that's similar. The idea here is, did the original authors possibly run the study 18 different ways and found the one way that they got statistically significant results, and then they published that way? And so can you, instead of doing a diff and diff, can you do a propensity score matching or a IV with a propensity score matching and see if you can get kind of a similar result? Theory of change analysis is there only one way to get to that ultimate outcome of interest that they're that they're publishing about, right? So in many papers they say, we did this intervention and it resulted in this outcome. But were there other things going on that could also account for what happened in that outcome? So in that original data, can you look at other things that were captured in it? Typically, a lot of these data sets are very rich, actually, if you look at them in the raw form, and see, is there another way to get to that final outcome? So do you have to do Y to get to Z, or can you also do X to get to Z? And if you can, then is it really Y that's causing that outcome? If someone wanted to scale this up, would they have to really do what they're focusing on, or could they do something else, or is it the combination of the two, right? So I'm going to introduce the program through example, and my example is agricultural commercialization. This is my personal research interest, one of them, so it makes sense for me. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but what the idea is that you're encouraging subsistence farmers to move into commercialized crops and transition from kind of producing food to eat to producing food to sell, or producing some kind of crop to sell and then relying on the market to buy the food they're going to eat. And this is, a fairly well-worn path in development theory. The idea of here, you have subsistence farmers who typically, in many places, don't have enough food. There's, in a lot of countries, kind of predefined lean seasons or hunger seasons. So you're trying to move them from this idea of growing the same crops they've grown for a long time to growing commercialized crops that are more in demand in the world. So a number of interventions will go in and say, hey, you should think about growing hot peppers or something like that. Or I've done research on tobacco, which is something that you can't eat, right? But you can make enough money that hopefully you can transition out of this cycle that you have been in before. The reason why you would transition out of the cycle outside of not having enough to eat is also that you typically have a comparative disadvantage in growing the subsistence crops that you've been growing for a long time. So coming from the University of Illinois in Champaign, where there's very rich farmland that my cousins farm, competing with my cousins on maize production is very hard because their soil, the economies of scale, all these things put the developing country farmers typically at a comparative advantage in those crops. But there are other crops that they could grow that they have a comparative advantage in. So if you grow tobacco or you grow hot peppers or something that requires more work and labor costs are lower in many of these countries, then suddenly you see there's gains to be made. And as you switch into that comparative advantage, like I said, you move from growing your own food to relying on the market for food and selling what you grow. So there has been some research on commercialization. Here's a list of some of the countries that people have looked at, and some of the research has been on sustainability of commercialization projects and household welfare. A lot of this research was done in the 80s and 90s. Recently, there's been a little bit more, but there aren't that many impact evaluations around, does this actually work? Despite that, there is still a lot of promotion of agricultural commercialization. So in the latest IFPRI report and the World Bank report, they're not necessarily focusing on this, but it is a section of these reports. The idea of incentivizing farmers to produce more commercialized crops, or discussing market failures that are preventing farmers from producing more commercialized crops. And like I said, there just hasn't been many impact evaluations of the intervention itself. So there have been some evaluations of what's preventing people from going into it, but not as much about actually pushing for it in the first place. So I decided to replicate this AJE paper by Ashraf, Gine, and Carlin. It's one of the few papers that I found that was an RCT around a export crop promotion and marketing intervention in Kenya. So the question here is, do agricultural commercialized interventions or commercialization interventions improve the household income of participants? And they found that the intervention increased export crop production and increased household income in certain aspects. And why is this important? Well, it's important, like I said, because this is believed to be one of the main interventions to break the chain of rural poverty. So agriculture is still one of the main industries of many of the poorest people in the world, and so finding ways to encourage them to break this chain is very important. So this intervention, I'll get right into it because we don't have that much time, it was done in Kenya, in one area of Kenya. This is from their paper, the appendix, and all of the black circles are treatment groups, and all of the clear circles, which might be harder to see here, are controls. And in this area, most of the population is rural, and most of the population is living below the poverty line, the Kenyan poverty line, and like I said before, there is a comparative advantage for them to move into commercialized crops, oftentimes. There's also a number of barriers to preventing people from growing commercialized crops. So you have risk-averse farmers who don't know about these crops. They don't know about the prices that they can get for them at export. They don't know or don't have the access to credit that might be required to grow them. And they also have potential for market holdup on the supply side. So they might not know the people that are going to want to source these crops or how to sell them. Yep. So the intervention was designed to get around those things, partially by directly linking the buyers with the sellers. So they created a system where they linked the value chain, and they went and told these farmers in the treatment group which crops to grow that were in demand in Europe. So the idea was that Kenya is very close to many of the European markets, so they would be able to fly these crops in, and to avoid this problematic sales, they formalized the relationship more, and they, in some places, for part of the treatment group, they provided credit, even though I'm not going to get into that as much in this presentation. So in our replication plan setup, I planned, and this is what I did mostly, is to try and recreate the original results. And then with my MEA, I looked at power issues and also recall bias issues that were present in part of the data, which I didn't understand when I originally started the project. And then I looked at alternative intervention impacts, different way to look at heterogeneous income or impacts. Yeah. So the sample, I reproduced the pre-intervention balance tables and independently recode everything. So I didn't use their do files for anything except for a little bit of cleaning when I had problems figuring out exactly what was working. And I'm able, after a while, which is in the paper, but I'm not going to spend time here, to exactly reproduce their original first table, which is where before they started, they looked at small holder groups and decided which ones would be in the control and treatment groups, and then they looked at the balance between them, and the balance is pretty good in this RCT. So they randomly selected 12 smaller groups to be in the control, 12 to be in the no credit treatment arm, and 12 to be in the credit treatment arm. And there's two, I couldn't put everything up here because it's just too much, but there's very few imbalances between the groups. And the imbalances that are there kind of favor the control group. So control group is closer to paved road, the control group has less time to get to market, things like that. So they then actually conducted the randomization, and at the baseline, these are the households that were in these smallholder groups, and the differences between them. These are the original study means, and these are my means. They're a little different, and there's 22 checks that they perform in this balance table. I can't reproduce all of them here, but I reproduced all that are significant, statistically significant. And you'll see that where they had differences, I had differences in the most part, except for in marketing expenses, which is transportation costs. And then I also had a number of differences that they didn't have. This is partially due, I would say, to trying to figure out how to impute a number of missing values that I didn't understand, and also because it was hard to assign treatment. So it was much harder to assign treatment than I expected. I have a table in the appendix here if you're interested in. I didn't get the exact number of households in the control and treatment groups, so that could be obviously affecting everything. But in general, the numbers are very close, and throughout the presentation, I'm going to be lumping the treatment groups together. So these control and the treatment are both a no credit and credit. This is partly because disentangling the credit and no credit treatment groups were much harder than I expected. So I stuck with this. So the theory of change that was kind of implicit here is that this drum nut intervention, which is a combination of telling people about which crops they might want to grow and providing some extension services and also formalizing this path to selling, will lead to an increase in the amount of land that is used for cash crops, or export crops is what they call them, and also the amount of export crops. And then they'll also simultaneously be decreasing the cost of growing these crops, which should lead to an increase in household income. So in my pure replication, like I said, I reproduced the original results using the same approach. And I'm only going to present a couple of their tables because they had a number, but I think this is the most important table. And there's a lot of numbers here, but the way that they set up their tables is they have this intent to treat OLS, and you have the export crops, and these are their results from their paper, and these are my results. And when the post, so the way they set it up is they had a baseline, and then they had a follow-up survey. And the follow-up survey is 1 year later. So when you interact the post period with it being in the treatment group, we see that should be red, that we're getting similar increases in the amount of export crops grown, or that they grow export crops at all, that they're devoting more land to export crops, and they're growing more baby corn. So there were 3 crops that they incentivized, one of which was passion fruit, and they decided afterwards that it took too long to actually grow passion fruit, and so no one was interested in it. So there's actually only 2 crops, and they only saw changes in baby corn. So French bean was already being grown, and they didn't see a lot of statistically significant changes in it. So I'm going to focus on their baby corn results, which they do see this strong statistical significant change in production. One of the things that confused me a lot during this replication study was this coefficient that is so large, this almost 400,000 kilogram increase in baby corn. And I'm getting much smaller numbers here. And what particularly confused me was the fact that the mean of their variable is 144. I couldn't figure out how they got 400,000. And then one of my referees suggested I look at their working paper, and it seems that the working paper results are 396. So I think it's a typo throughout their paper. There's a couple of these actually in baby corn, also in marketing expenses. So they see a decrease in the cost of transportation of 3,528, and I get 1.825. Same statistical significance, and in their paper, the working paper, it's a decimal point. So it's something I don't want to focus on because I don't want to say that the whole year that I spent doing this replication was to find a decimal point, but it is something that confused me a lot. And so throughout the rest of the paper, I'll assume that this is a decimal point and not a comma, in the American way of a decimal point. And then something that I think is very important to point out here is that neither they nor I found a statistical significance in the change in the amount of log of household income. So after a year, which might just be too short to actually see a lot of change, they are seeing the treatment group has a positive coefficient but not statistically significant. And mine is actually much larger than theirs relative, but it's still not statistically significant. So in their study, they look at heterogeneous impacts. And their idea is that previous adopters of export crops might look different. So people that had grown this at the time of baseline might have a different outcome than people that were new to growing these export crops. So these tables are even harder, I think, to read, but I set it up the same way that they did, which is, did you grow export crops at the baseline, yes or no? And if so, looking at each of the outcomes of interest. So these are my results and these are their results. You see when you interact the post period with the treatment that we're getting similar numbers, similar statistical significance in the increases really for new adopters. So people who have not grown export crops before, we're seeing that they're growing a statistically significant more amount of these crops. What I don't see is this statistical significance here in the amount of baby corn that they're growing, even though the original paper saw it. I see it a little bit in the, for the people that had grown before, but not for the new people. But I do see the same kind of statistical significance in the decrease here in the transportation costs and in the, most importantly, in the log of household income. So even though they don't really push it in their paper, I think if you were a policymaker reading this paper, this is the result that you might take away, right? Is that this intervention really works for people who had not grown export crops before. You see this large, statistically significant increase in the log of household income after a year. So, to try and speed it up a little bit, I looked at the measurement and estimation analysis from a recall bias perspective and a power perspective. So what I didn't understand at the time of starting this replication study was that, so they had this baseline and they had this follow-up. But they realized in the middle that they didn't have enough sample size. So they ended up interviewing an extra 500 households, 390-ish, who were actually eligible for the study, the intervention, because they had been members of smaller groups at the time of the baseline. And what they did was they asked them, since they didn't have a baseline for these households, they asked them to think back a year to that time and to give their answers on what they were producing and all of that. And so I decided to look at these households to break them out and see what just the balance, starting with, looks like between the original baseline means and the extra 500 means. And I start to see, there's 22, and I see about 9 or 10 statistically significant differences between the means of the original group and the extra 500 group. And then I tried to look at, thinking at it intuitively, what would be hardest kind of to remember a year ago of the things that I asked. And I thought probably the percent of land devoted to cash crops at the baseline might be hardest, because you're asking someone a year ago, what percent of your land are you using to grow cash crops? And I see here with the original baseline, there's kind of a distribution, I would say a wide distribution of responses to what percent of your land are you using for cash crops. And when you look at the extra 500, the responses really seem to be clustered kind of around 33 and 50%, which kind of makes sense to me. I would think you might estimate a year ago I grew about half of my crops. So here I thought about power, and I know statisticians are worried about retrospective power analyses. So I didn't want to focus on this a lot, but I thought it was kind of interesting, especially if you want to look at something like the log of household income, which is probably the most interesting result here, and say, do you include the extra 500? Well, you can't here because they didn't ask them retrospective baseline on their log of household income. So I get the intercluster correlation coefficient and the minimum detectable effect size. And not surprisingly, since it wasn't significant, in the whole sample, the coefficients sizes that I found in my replication and that they found in their original study are well below the needed minimum detectable effect size to see statistical significance. One of my referees, Heather actually, since she didn't blind herself, asked me to you didn't have to, asked me how many people would they have had to interview to possibly see statistical significance. I spoke with a statistician. There's some debate on this, on how you would do this, possibly pooling the same observations over and over again and running Monte Carlos. I performed kind of a back of the envelope calculation, found that the sample size would need to be about triple the size that they had originally. Okay, so trying to finish up, theory of change. I looked really at their previous adopter definition because I wasn't sure. This is 2009 when they wrote this paper, so there wasn't a lot of registration going on at that time. It wasn't clear to me why they chose that specific previous adopter definition. I thought there was a number of different things that you could have looked at. And so I look at their previously grew export crop heterogeneous impacts versus previously grew any cash crop at all, as they define cash crop, or previously sold to a market. So my idea here, really in my replication plan too, is that I think it's more important to get farmers involved in the selling than it is what they're specifically selling. So if they were already selling, I think that might be more important than if they were already selling the specific crops that they were pushing for in the intervention. So the policy implications here are somewhat strong. Like I said before, I think if you just read this paper as a policymaker, you might take away that new export crop producers are the people that you should be targeting, because they're where you're seeing these strong increases in household income. And our replication study generally supports that idea. But I'd like to know if it was robust to alternative definitions of previously adopter. So first I start with their previous export crop adopter definition, and when I look at it from were you a previous adopter in the entire pooled sample, so what they do is they pool the original sample with the extra 500 sample to get their results. You see that it's about 50-50, it looks pretty good. But then when I break out the original baseline versus the extra 500 baseline, you see kind of, I would say, fairly large differences in what percentage of these people were previously adopters. So about 43% had previously been adopting in the original sample, and or had not been previously adopting, and a little over 70% had not adopted in the extra 500 sample. So then I run all the results. I don't have the space here or the time to go through all of them, but I wanted to focus on the log of household income, excluding the extra 500, because they didn't ask the extra 500 to retrospectively report if they were selling to markets, so I can't compare them. But it reduces my sample sizes a fair amount. But I reproduce all the results here. So these are their results excluding the extra 500. We're still seeing this large statistically significant increase if you had not previously grown export crops in your log of household income. The previously grew cash crop ended up not really working. This was in my replication plan. The reason it didn't work, I would say, is because almost the whole sample previously grew some kind of cash crop. So I'm heavily discounting these results since the N is so small here. But this previously sold to market, that should say sold to market, sorry. The results here are similar and supportive of the idea that it might not be simply selling the specific crops that they're supporting, but it might be more about thinking about selling to a market in general. So if you had previously sold to a market, then we're actually seeing a statistically significant decrease in your household income. But if you had not previously sold to a market and you were in the treatment group, we were seeing a statistically significant increase. So my conclusions here are that the replication study is generally robust, I would say, albeit there are significantly lower coefficients in a number of places, and I I have some concerns about this recall bias, or the possibility of recall bias in the data. And I think I'm hoping that it really encourages some other people to think more about agricultural commercialization and possible research ideas there. So I'd like to acknowledge my co-author and 3IE for supporting this research, the original authors, and a number of RAs that helped me put the data together. And if you have any questions or comments, I have a couple of discussants, but I'd love to hear more. This paper is coming out in a working paper version in a couple weeks, but I'm going to be submitting it probably the next couple of months, hopefully, for a publication. So please feel free, if you don't have enough time here or you want to email me, to contact me. The replication program has an upcoming replication window. So after hearing about what we do with replication, if there's any publications that you think, hey, this is a really innovative or influential or controversial paper that I think would be important to replicate, please feel free to contact me personally or to email us at replication@3ieimpact.org. So thank you very much.